Good evening. This is Laws 19038, Week 6, covering material from Week 5. The material comes from Bates, page 255 in the current, that is the 8th edition. And the topic for tonight is in relation to conservation of biological diversity and ecological sustainability. This is all to do with ecologically sustainable development. As usual, I'll be referring heavily to the commentary, and I invite you to follow my comments in this regard. I start off at point 766, paragraph 7.66, where the definition of ecologically sustainable development is referred to in Australia as conservation of biological diversity as being a fundamental consideration in decision making. The reference there is to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act 1999. If we go over to 7.67, I'll get it right eventually. When we're talking about ecologically sustainable development, we need to note that it does not require biodiversity conservation as a necessary component of sustainable development. The point that I'm trying to stress there is that biodiversity conservation, though important, is not something that must be taken into account when considering principles of ecologically sustainable development. Bates says, where a number of factors are mandated for consideration without any statutory indication as to the priority or weight to be accorded to the various factors, then the relevance of each of these factors is a question of fact for the decision makers to determine. Therefore, if protection of biodiversity is, at the most, accorded a weighting by the legislation only equal to the other factors which consideration must be given, then the due weight to be accorded to biodiversity protection after proper consideration by the decision maker may legitimately be determined to be nil. So the point there is that biodiversity conservation could in fact legally be ignored when considering aspects of ecologically sustainable development. That's unlikely to happen, but it could happen. Decision makers are able to lawfully make decisions that impact significant and adverse interests on biodiversity. Use of the precautionary principle to address potential impacts on biodiversity is welcome. However, the list of threatened species is likely to continue to grow, says Bates. The next topic, and tonight is a very short session, is improved valuation, pricing and incentive mechanisms. At 7.68, the author says, this principle means that environmental factors should be included in the valuation of assets and services. Polluter pays is a principle. The user of goods and services should pay prices based on the full life cycle costs of providing goods and services. This principle, says Bates on page 257, is based on the policy that if the real value of natural resources is reflected in the cost of using those resources, then resources will be sustainably used and managed and not wasted. This, of course, begs the question whether we can value environmental assets and on what basis we should do so. That's what I have gleaned as being the important principle from that section. Finally, the conclusion at 7.70 is this. Bates says, clearly the principles of ecologically sustainable development are intended to influence government and therefore corporate and individual decision making. However, as principles, they tell us little about how to translate the concepts into a practical action. As familiarity with the principles grows, courts and tribunals play an important role by setting the benchmarks for future decision making. I appreciate tonight is a very quick session. The reason it's quick is twofold. The first is that next week's session, which is really this week's reading, is Bates Chapter 5. Now that's a very meaty section and it deals with federal governance. I propose to deal with that next week on Wednesday, which would be the 16th, and I would invite you to read that chapter in detail before next week. By next week, we should be moving also into week 7 material, which is Bates chapters 11 and 12. At this stage, I'll sign off, and all the best with your studies. Thank you.